So you can see, folks, I always appreciate that people bring their whole selves to work. This is part of one of the unintended consequences of Zoom calls, is that we get to see people in their work environments and in their home environments, and you get to see their pets. It's much more human, and I appreciate that. I'm at the office today, but many of you know that I have a dog and a couple of cats, and they've made various sneak appearances during Zoom. So really helpful for us to have these kind of soundbite opportunities to get people's clarity in terms of what they think is important and what they've learned. And we have colleagues here working at CUI who are collecting these key takeaways and key themes, and we're going to be distilling them. And in fact, we can continue. For those of you on the chat, if you want to volunteer some common themes that you start to hear over the broadcast, by all means, put them into the chat so that we benefit from your observations as well. So the next session is on making better lives, and it's a very specific story that I'm hoping we can get Betty and Donnie to tell us about. These are folks that we've talked to. Hi, gang. We've talked to them before on City Talk, and actually through a whole process that has been going on for the 1,000 days and before the 1,000 days, and will carry on into the next 1,000 days, obviously. I appreciate all our West Coast friends who are coming in early, including Betty and Donnie, who have got their morning coffee, I hope, and joining us bright and early. And I want you two to talk to us. We called your session Making Better Lives. And I don't know if people would understand that park managers are about making better lives, which is why we titled it that way, for you to be able to talk about your experience and what you've learned in the last 1,000 days and what you think should be the priority going forward in the next 1,000, realizing we're at this moment and how does it look today? So Betty, do you want to go first, and then we'll go to Donnie, and really appreciate you coming on and just spending a few minutes with us, giving us your reflections.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be here. Oh, sorry about that. It's very exciting when I think about 1,000 days, first of all, when we first talked about it, and it's so many things that happened. And as I've been listening to your sessions, there's been incredible movement in the equity, in the rights-based way to work with individuals. And I think this is where my focus has absolutely been on with Vancouver Parks and Rec. So looking at the justice, equity, decolonization, diversity and inclusion, and how do we bring that to the most vulnerable people? And during COVID, we've seen an increase of disparity. We've seen an increase of more vulnerable on the streets, work-wise. So looking at that from a different lens and being able to put all those lenses on the work that we do to ensure that all park users have the equal opportunity for their health and well-being while utilizing parks, utilizing recreation centers. And one of the things that we've also been doing is working closely with the Indigenous population. From my point of view, we've seen an increase as well as ceremony. The need for ceremony, for calmness, for acknowledgement, for storytelling, for sharing the history. And so we've worked closely with those Indigenous organizations that are putting on the ceremonies and working with fire. So we're able to do ceremonial fires without the disruptions, without doing a lot of paperwork, so people can heal. And people can get together, and people can also share what they're doing.
Oops, I muted myself, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting on-the-ground learning, hey, Betty? That there's a way to take what is a visceral crisis and for some constituencies seen as a kind of mess, let's say, and turn it into actually an opportunity for a new relationship, a step forward, right? Which Absolutely. I guess is to me, that's one of the sort of salient learnings through COVID and it's hard to necessarily get everybody into that place, that it was hard, it was painful, it's been awful for a lot of people, but we can find a way to move forward in a constructive way and learn from it. I don't know if at 1,000 days we're quite at that point, but I'm interested in your observation about that, about how you could stitch that ritual and that acknowledgement into the process, eh? Yeah.
Yes.
Donnie, do you want to talk a little bit about? I mean, you've had several iterations of this in your park system. over the last 1,000 days. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you have gleaned from that in terms of the lessons that you've been seeing?
Sure. Thanks, Mary. And as you mentioned, Betty and I are joining from Vancouver, the um, homeland of the Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And, interesting talking about your first speakers talking about land acknowledgements. And we have, I think, really focused on living reconciliation and learning publicly and making mistakes and driving or supporting policy that moves us in the direction of living in reconciliation and reconciliation in action. Many of you will know that the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation recently passed a motion to co-manage our parks. This happened during COVID. This happened in the last number of months. And we're already co-managing one of Canada's largest urban parks, Stanley Park. We're working with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh to develop a 100-year plan, not just the usual 10 or 25-year plan, but a 100-year plan for this 1,000-acre park. And many of you may or may not know this, but the inception of the park board was based on colonial actions to move people from Stanley Park, Indigenous people who had their homes in Stanley Park. And the reason the park board started was to take over Stanley Park and operate the park. During COVID, parks and community centers went from being caution taped off. The biggest heartbreak that I experienced in my professional world, beyond seeing people living in our parks the way they have been, was seeing our playgrounds taped off and spaces of social connectivity where we relied on those spaces being closed, and it was just a hard, like, caution tape closed. And they went from being shut down and this big fear that was out there to being places of safety, whether you were having your child's birthday party now in the park because you weren't having it in your home, which is a trend that has continued and grown, right to needing to seek shelter in our parks. And during COVID, we saw us go from not allowing, but for it being permissible for people to seek shelter in our parks overnight, to designating space during the day where people need to are permitted to seek shelter, and essentially have camp until there's enough housing available. I think it's important to note that many folks transitioned to working from home, and parks and recreation staff were still on the ground, and actually the pressure on our parks only grew. People were using it in different ways, and they were using it exponentially more. And so whether it was park maintenance, or emptying garbages, or the angst that people feel and felt during this time, and then you get them into social settings, and behaviors have changed. Public behavior has changed, and our park staff are oftentimes, we call the Parks and Rec folks the second responders, but in many cases they're first responders in a situation, and they're dealing with a changed public feeling about a social feeling about public spaces. And the respect level and the use of our spaces has changed drastically. Just going back to, we had Strathcona Park encampment during the COVID times, and dealing with an encampment and making the priority, as Betty said, it's prioritizing the health of people in the camp. In the encampment, while also understanding the angst of the surrounding community and also the people working there. Betty and I were both going into Strathcona Park, 500 tents, and almost as many people at its height, wearing masks, and people there were scared, and so it was just a different climate. And I think, coming out of that, we've learned that people need that, well, they need that human kindness, but that their human rights needed to be centered in our work.
Mhm. I mean, go ahead, Betty, were you going to chime in behind that? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the importance of connectivity, and you see it more and more during that time, even though there appeared to be more suffering, it was the connectivity they needed. And well, many people were going and get vaccinated. What we did was we talked to Vancouver Coastal Health. We had them come into the camp and do several rounds of vaccination because everybody deserves that. And I think we saw more organizations stepping up and coming together where they may not have gone into the camp before, doing that to ensure that people had equal opportunity as everybody else for health and well-being, and not just because of the situation that they're experiencing. And as Donnie said, within Parks and Rec during the COVID time, it was about 25% increase use of outdoor space because particularly in Vancouver, people's homes may be smaller. So outside gave an opportunity to connect with loved ones, to connect with colleagues, with families. And so that really supported with mental health and keeping up those areas so people can enjoy it, brought probably a calmness to their day, because as we know with COVID, for having a long stretch of time, our human brain, we've seen more mental health issues because that's a long period of time to be in distress and to be in the unknown. And so being in distress and unknown for so long, but we know what nature does for the body, mind, and spirit. And so the ability to be able to provide that for people's health and well-being, whether they're sheltering in the parks or whether they're utilizing the parks in other ways.
And your comment about ceremony at the beginning reinforces that, that this is a kind of how to find a way to make this an exercise, an integration of ourselves in our places. It's tricky, I know. It's interesting. And one of the things that I glean from hearing you folks and watching how you've done this, because I've been there at different iterations as this journey has been going on with the park population, is this idea that you meet people where they are. And so your illustration about we took the vaccinations into the park. I know, Donnie, that when you were working on Strathcona, you had multiple daily meetings and rituals, and the other thing I would say is this idea of collaboration, that somehow when there was a crisis, somehow our jurisdictional fights fell away and we just rolled our sleeves up.
Mary, maybe I'll start because I know Betty will have way better things to say than me on this. But, interestingly, somebody commented, never waste a good crisis. Yeah, Betty and I actually met at Strathcona Park. She was working for BC Housing. I was working for Parks and Rec. It's a sign of the times that Betty is now working in Parks and Rec. That, to me, you're right. Like, talk about breaking down barriers. Being on the Parks and Recreation team, coming from the background that Betty comes from, we recognize that, we as Parks and Recreation professionals don't have the experience to work with people who are unhoused. And so bringing Betty into the fold and having her teach us and learn with her has been just eye-opening and a gift beyond belief. So I'll stop talking and we'll talk with Betty then.
Thanks, Donnie. It's been a tremendous growth for me as well. And I think throughout my career in doing community development work, one of the things that I often think of, sometimes chaos begets order. And I think that's sort of what has occurred, Mary, when you're talking about it took a crisis and now we're all working together. And I see that because Vancouver is experiencing two encampments simultaneously right now with Hastings and Crab. And now ministries, all levels of government are participating to see how we can all support each other, but most of all, how can we support everyone? And as you said, Mary, taking people where they're at, and which is sometimes difficult because everybody wants to put everybody in a group. So they're houseless. Let's deal with it as a houselessness issue, when no, everybody has their own reason for being houseless, for being precariously housed. And so we have to do individual. We have to know what each individual needs for their support and their well-being and for them to have success. So it's taking time and all the ministries that are needing to be involved to look at that system and how the system may have been very much a part of where people are at today.
Betty, I know we need to talk about systems. We just had a session on transit, and one thing I wanted to just loop in, and it was about transit and housing. And what was interesting is that Hawaida was with us from the city of Edmonton, and she made a comment not dissimilar to what you just said, Donnie. You're describing park rangers or park, I don't know what the name, the noun is, but a person that works in a park suddenly is becoming a triage person or is becoming a referral agent or has to have, in the same way we have Dale McPhee, the chief of police in Edmonton, joining us at the end of the broadcast, and shortly Peter Slowly, the former chief of police in Ottawa. And I know they're going to talk about the multi-skilling that needs to happen in terms of urban workforces. And so I'm struck by that we all have to be able to do several different things. And I'm curious about, when we talk about system change, Betty, what frightens me about it is it feels very bureaucratic to me. It feels like, oh, someone's going to go and change the system. But you two, Betty and Donnie, you're changing the system there, right on the spot, right? Does that mean no?
Well, no, I was actually speechless because I was like, wow, never seen it that way, right? You're doing this work for people. You're doing the work through rights-based lens. You're doing the work through lived experience. You're doing it, but you're absolutely right. But everybody can be a part of changing a system. And I think that's where we begin. And I think that's what COVID has done too. It's allowed us to share our stories and our experience and learn, no different than knowledge keepers that share so we can understand the past so we can do things differently.
Mm-hmm. Donnie, do you have a thought on that? I mean, I doubt you guys wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to change the system. But it feels to me, as the person sitting here at the Canadian Urban Institute, I feel like we are watching across the country systems being disrupted. And part of the challenge for us, I think, in our role is how do we take what you've learned, what you've shown is a better approach, and get that to be more part of the new approach that more people take in the system.
Mary, I think that, first of all, thank you. And you're right. We don't wake up that way, but I've worked in Parks and Recreation for over 30 years now, and there's always been an interesting bump up against or integration with social services. And, it kind of, it vacillates between, well, we're right in there providing connection to social services, and in some cases providing what some might call a social service, right to, nope, we're going to be Parks and Recreation and we're going to do traditional Parks and Recreation. I think it's important that we are a nimble industry, and that we do have to adjust to what's going on. People come to our spaces in their time of need or in their time of their choice, their leisure time. And we have to be able to be nimble with that and to be able to understand what the needs are. When we have seniors going indoors to our programs, we don't just offer the programming that, that I want to do, not to say that I qualify, but I do. We have to adapt to what they want to do and how active they want to be, and how social they need to be. So, we have to be an adaptable industry. And I think that it's telling right now. And for you to say that we're changing things is great to hear, because that's what we should be.
Well, I feel very strongly you are. And even with the challenges that continue to present themselves, as you suggest, you've got Crab Park now, you've got Hastings as well. And, the media will glom onto certain aspects of that, but you need to know that there's a whole constituency of people building cities across this country and participating who watch with great interest as you approach these things differently and compassionately, putting people first from a rights approach and being really imaginative and dropping a lot of judgment about how people make choices in their lives and find themselves hopefully appreciating the benefits that parks can bring, which are multiple. If there's anything we can pull out of COVID, it's that parks deliver multiple benefits. You know. Anyway, who's that, Donnie?
This is Layla, so she had to make a cameo as well.
Hi, Layla.
Hi, Layla.
Smart. Really, really great to have both of you on. We continue to watch with great interest as you work in that collaborative allyship way in Vancouver and all the important things that you're drawing from that. We really appreciate you taking some time to be with us today as we think about the next 1,000 days. Nice to see you, Betty. Thanks, Donnie. Always great to have you.
Thanks, Mary.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mary. See you.
Bye.